Hello, time for another vlog. This one's kind of sparked by the climate strikes that students are committing or doing around the world. I was musing about this on my way back home from my non-vegetarian breakfast at McDonald's. Because on March 15th, when I was at work, about 1 million or more, I've seen estimates up to 1.4 million students were on strike around the world in about 2,000 different schools, I think. And indeed, Greta Thunberg has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, apparently. It is rumoured. Although about 300 people get nominated every year, or each year, and including Donald Trump this year as well, for some reason. the dropper of the mother of all bombs is nominated for the Peace Prize. Anyway. But yes, it's interesting that a lot of students are going on strike to try and get some action. And it has to be said, of course, no action has come of it yet at all, as far as I'm aware, so far. Because it's not enough pressure on the politicians as yet. I mean, in this country they're sort of bemused by Brexit and voting again and again to turn down Theresa May's amazing deal. Because they didn't get the vote right the first time, it's got to keep going back. Yes. It's an old European tradition. But I was wondering, how can the students get some action out of politicians? I mean, at the moment, these people cannot vote, the students, right? Most of them. Because they're mostly school children. But of course, in years to come, they will have the vote. And those politicians who've ignored them maybe won't get voted for. It has to be said, the current crop of politicians are useless on this issue. They fob us off with tinkering, basically, and no fundamental changes are made at all. And of course, fundamental change is what is required. Another thought struck me about the climate strikes, which is that whether you agree with Brexit or whether you agree with Donald Trump or not, the climate strikes are like Brexit and the fact that Donald Trump won the election in America, the United States, in that it seems to me they are all signs of widespread dissatisfaction with the politics of complacency, really, or complacency politics. As Greta Thunberg said, students may be losing a day of schooling, but the politicians have lost 30 years on this issue. And we only have maybe 5 left before we hit 1.5 degrees warming, which many countries have promised to try and prevent, but the measures at the Paris Agreement were of course minuscule, and the commitment of various countries is not up to it. So the only conclusion really is we either fix this system of government or we get rid of it. Now I will say that our system has great flexibility, and it is the best system that we as a species have come up with through all of history, probably. At least the best system in dealing with large numbers of people. Possibly when we lived in little Stone Age villages there were better systems, but they didn't scale, right? And what we ended up with was warlords and eventually ruling classes, and even quite early on ruling classes. Certainly as soon as civilization existed there were ruling classes, so probably there were ruling classes before then too. And I don't think that aspect of our system is going to change anytime soon. We'll just have to accept that, I think. Whatever change happens is going to have to be accepted by the ruling classes. Or there's always revolution, of course, but the trouble with that is the ruling classes usually win those. Take, for example, the revolution in Egypt a few years ago. Yeah, the government was kicked out. A new ruling class made up of much the same people took over. Look at the Soviet Union. The revolution back in 1917 or so, yeah, that kicked out the aristocratic classes for the most part, but a new ruling class took their place. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, the same ruling class remained in power. Different individuals in some cases, but I mean Putin and Gorbachev and people like this, they were KGB people, right? So it's the same people in control anyway. Our system in the West, and the Western system is more or less used all over the world, is based on the idea that we, the ordinary folk, make money for them, the ruling classes. I mean, it's a less drastic system than the older systems of outright slavery and so on. But it's essentially the same system. It's organised so that people produce for them, and they can produce a military so that they can maintain their power against competitors who are also doing the same thing. And the system is run pretty much at almost any cost in terms of people's lives, numbers of lives lost, and at any cost to other species as well. And I think that the real powers that be, are aware that things are going too far in that respect. But it's not clear whether they are ultimately benevolent or ultimately selfish, or whether those two are even the same thing. I guess David Icke would say they are not benevolent. They want to make the planet uninhabitable, more or less, so it's more suitable for their lizard species. I'm sceptical, but you can see where he's coming from with the neglect of the planet that we actually get with our current system. Another part of our system, apart from the make money at all costs imperative, is that we have a pretend democracy in the West, or pretend democracies, where voting makes almost no difference. It can make a bit of a difference sometimes. Look at Brexit. It's pretty clear that the authorities were expecting to win that vote, and the public thought, here's a chance to give them a kicking, because we're fed up with complacency politics, right? Same with Donald Trump, I think, although clearly he's in with the in crowd to some degree too, because he's still pursuing more or less the same empire agenda. in different ways, though. I mean, in terms of international politics, he seems better than Obama, to me. But that's just my opinion. He's crazy. That's not relevant to this discussion. But voting for him was relevant because it's a chance to, again, give the conventional, complacent politicians a bit of a kicking. We also have in the current system a form of corporate capitalism where the rules of trade favour larger and larger businesses and multinational corporations and even law-breaking companies like the social media companies and their family of crooks in Silicon Valley, right? Where they get big by breaking all sorts of rules and then eventually are locked down, maybe. And because they're so wealthy, the American government turns a blind eye to it or lets it pass and says, behave yourselves now. And they don't. Yet. So that's kind of what we have. It's a bit of a stormy day in case you can hear the breeze. We've had a stormy couple of weeks in Britain. And this system, incidentally, the rules for business also don't protect the environment, except there are exceptions, like you mustn't do this and that, okay, but the basic rule is that corporations must benefit their shareholders. That's their primary goal. Nothing else. And if it's in some other country, like a British-based multinational corporation is trashing Africa or something, then nobody cares because the shareholders are making money. And we're going to reap the consequences in climate change, presumably, of rules like that and governments like that. And people like ourselves like that who don't complain about it, or who go and work for these companies, in fact. So in some cases there's not much choice because there's no other jobs. But I think when you're young and are choosing a career, then you can afford to take the risk. I mean, I've considered climate strike okay, but I need my job. I can't pay the rent otherwise. It's a bit difficult. But if it becomes popular enough that people with jobs can start to get involved too, then I would be inclined to join it. It's not there yet, but I'm hoping. And I don't think my employers will like it though. But anyway. One of the good things about the current system is that it can adapt. It's very adaptable, in fact. It can absorb features of competing systems in order to survive. So, for example, in the early 20th century, it was up against socialism and communism, and there was a real risk at times of revolutions in the West. But eventually, our system adopted the welfare state kind of approach. So providing enough welfare for the citizens that they didn't feel like starting a revolution. I would say the West is losing ground on that again now, especially in the United States. And if you look on YouTube for videos about Skid Row in LA or the Down and Outs in San Francisco and places like that, there's loads of people homeless all over the West. Paris, lots. There's some in London, many more than there used to be in London. But clearly in the United States the system is not taking care of its citizens. It's totally neglecting them as far as I can see, as an outsider. You look at Skid Row in Los Angeles, that's an area of 50 blocks with about 9,000 homeless people in it. I think there's many more in LA as a whole. There's about 9 public toilets for those people, I think, or 8. I think it's a clear sign the system is failing, because this has been going on for years and years and years, and the county is spending huge amounts of money, apparently without success in dealing with it, because they're not prepared really to give the homeless people enough money or accommodation to deal with the problems somehow. It's very strange. And I wonder if it's part of the explanation for the increasing racism and violence that we're seeing in the West, because people are not inclined to invest in a system which doesn't care about them. If you and I are just a commodity, then why should I care about that system? It's got nothing for me. What ordinary people want really is a fair share, actually. We have ruling classes where the top 1% or something own as much wealth as the lowest half of the entire planet. And the average citizen in the West, although we are much better off than people throughout the rest of the world mostly, we're actually, for the most part, only just getting by. The majority of people in, I think, all Western countries have only a couple of weeks or months worth of money set aside, that if they lose their jobs they are immediately dependent on welfare. And in some societies there isn't much of that. So we do have a system, and I don't know if our system is going to be able to adapt to this climate change issue, because obviously the politicians the current generation are completely useless, and they need to buck up or get out, really. And when the younger generation grows up and starts voting, they're going to have to vote against these people to get rid of them. That's the only way. Unless they can do something, okay. I mean, looking at the homeless situation, it's controversial, but people perhaps should be provided with housing. In the old Soviet Union, bad though it was, in many ways, particularly the Gulag Archipelago and all that, they provided people with free houses and flats. And even dachas, I think. Second country homes, like, in some cases. And property ownership is thought by many libertarian thinkers to be the fundamental basis of a good civil society. If you have a property, some real estate, a home, you are going to support society to help you maintain that. If you're living on Skid Row, on the other hand, or you're renting some poxy little hole in some crowded, polluted borough, maybe you're not going to support that society because it's not really taking care of you. It's like quid pro quo, really. We work all our lives, and what do we get back? Not much. We're still alive, but that's only so that we can work. It doesn't feel right. So the system, I think, needs to adapt, and I think one adaptation that it may have to make is to ensure that every citizen has their own property. We need to get rid of the rentier class, actually. And people have to have their own property. Ultimately. Now, to pay my rent, I rent out a spare room in the flat that I'm renting. But all of that, ultimately, would have to go. It's just not a good system, I think. Another thing would be a universal basic income, or something like that, to provide all citizens with adequate money, because the system is based on money, and money does work as a way of determining supply and demand, determining what to produce. But we, the people, have to demand less polluting junk. But it's very difficult. When I go to the supermarket, for example, just to buy my lunch or buy some food, okay, I might buy some vegetarian stuff. Like I've got some samosas in the fridge, some vegetable samosas. Lovely, okay. They're not, but you know, I can eat them. But they come in a single-use plastic package. Why? It's lightweight, that's why. It's cheap to transport. It's cheap to make. Some sort of cardboard packaging would probably be worse that way. It would probably be more expensive to transport or something. I don't know. Are we going to start using biodegradable plastics at last? There have been some inventions over the past few years that maybe we can start applying them. But in part it's up to us as the public to demand it, but in part it's up to the supermarkets and the big chains to get on with it, because there's almost no alternative for people, actually. If I go to the shops, I have to buy what's there. I have to eat, and I have to buy it however it's packaged. Another problem with our system, and it could change, is that it currently is based on measuring GDP. The primary measure of society's success, it seems, is GDP. Politicians are obsessed with gross domestic product. The GDP is like basically how much money the economy makes every year. And of course, if you have a good GDP, then you can have a good military and you can protect your country from the psychos abroad. And historically that has been very important. So, yeah, we have to do it. As for now, anyway, until humans have evolved a bit more, or exterminated themselves. But instead of GDP, we would have to have some measure based in part on GDP. It has to be there. But instead of perpetual growth, we have to look at human values, I think. We have to adapt it so that we measure happiness and well-being of people. And any society that has any significant number of homeless people has to fail, I think, on that. And also we should be looking at environmental quality as a measure of society's success. And of course food, shelter, and general quality of life questions, but quality of life not measured financially. If you have a universal basic income and you have your free accommodation, the rest of the economy is up to you. I think that might work better, especially with a generation which is environmentally conscious. Another issue that might have to change is that companies at the moment are regarded as persons in law, which helps them with their limited liability issues, because you can say this is the company's money, the company is responsible, not me as director, in some issues. And we also have to change the idea that companies are working primarily for the benefit of their shareholders. They need to work for the benefit of their shareholders and society or the environment or something. We have to think about priorities here. Companies are sometimes regarded as persons. They are persons in law, so that they can have their own money and manage it separately from the individuals in the company. But when it comes to other powers and freedom to influence government and so on, at the moment they are able to lobby, because the idea is that the company's free speech is representing the people within it, the members of the company, the shareholders. But this is fiction. It's nonsense. And it certainly doesn't... You've got a giant corporation like, I don't know, Rupert Murdoch's News International. I don't think that represents the opinions of its shareholders, and I don't think it represents the opinions of its workers. But the best thing the workers can do is resign from companies if they don't like them, or make their opinion felt and get the sack, whichever. But don't work for bad companies. Easier said than done, especially in some areas where there are not many jobs, but that is totally up to us as individuals, and I think it's going to be an important pressure point for businesses in the future. And these striking students on the climate strike need to think about that when they start taking up their jobs and when they start voting. I'm not convinced the Green Party in Britain is a great thing to vote for, because they tend to be a bit communist. And I do think that the capitalist system is probably better, even the corporate capitalist system, but we probably need something in between, or the system to adopt features of other systems as it's done before. So that's my rant for the day. Let me know what you think, and bye for now.